When one of the parish councillors suggested to me a while ago that I give some talks here last year on the subject of scandals in the church, I have to say I wasn't very keen on the idea at first, because it sounded a really depressing subject. As I came to prepare the talks, I discovered I was learning a lot myself. The main thing that became clear to me is that the church has always been in need of renewal and purification right from the very beginning. In today's Gospel passage, we heard a well-known story about Jesus himself dealing with a form of religious abuse, selling of animals for sacrifice in the outer courts of the temple during Passover festival time. It wasn't the selling itself that Jesus objected to, since clearly people had to have somewhere near the temple to buy animals for sacrifice. The changing of coins was also necessary, since all Jews over the age of 20 were expected to pay a half-shekel tax for the upkeep of the temple every year. They were not allowed to pay it in Greek or Roman currency, since those coins bore the image of pagan rulers. Rather, it was the way these practical needs had been allowed to obscure the true purpose of the temple as a place of worship. One can just imagine the noise, commotion and shouting, probably a bit like the stock exchange on a busy day. Say nothing of the smell of, well, let's put it politely, of manure. And all this because the temple authorities would have made money by allowing trading in the temple grounds. All sadly reminiscent of what happened 1,500 years later when the sale of indulgences in Rome to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica sparked off the Protestant Reformation. And it's very interesting that St. John in his Gospel, the one we heard today, unlike the other Gospel writers, puts this incident right at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, not at the end. It's as if he's pointing out to us that when Jesus comes to us, he always begins by reforming abuses and purifying from sin, whether in our own personal life or in the church. Today we are, of course, terribly aware of the scandal of sexual abuse that was allowed to grow in the church like a weed, and of how the church will get nowhere with its mission until that is thoroughly wiped out. In this country, very strict measures have been put in place to deal with this problem, so much so that one expert, who is not even a Christian herself, recently said that the Catholic Church in this country is probably one of the safest places for a child to be. Of course, there's never any room for complacency. In fact, when we look back over the Church's history, we can see that there's always been a need for renewal, for purification. In the earliest days, the Christians lived in close harmony with the teachings of Jesus, forgiving their enemies, sharing their possessions freely, caring for the poor, and even being willing to die for their faith. But as the church grew in subsequent centuries, and especially when it was freed from the threat of persecution and attained a position of great power and influence, compromise, decadence frequently set in. And so throughout history we see a whole series of renewal movements, from the monks who went out in the deserts of Egypt and the Holy Land, right up to the lay movements of our own time, rising up to call the church back to what we should be. And of course, those who call for reform and purification are often very harshly dealt with in their own lifetime. Think of the prophets of the Old Testament, or great religious reformers like St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross, to say nothing of our Lord himself. Often they met with ridicule and outright persecution. There's a particular way in which the modern world has of ridiculing people who call for a more wholehearted following of Christ, such as we seek hopefully in this season of Lent. And that is to call them fundamentalists or fanatics. I remember a few years ago when the Bishop of Lancaster produced a very powerful document asking some hard-hitting questions about our Catholic schools, as to whether some of them had lost their Catholic identity, outlining what a truly Catholic school would look like. I seem to remember he was rewarded not only with a lot of silence from other clerics, but even with questions asked in a parliamentary committee as to where all this might be leading to. And one of his questions in that committee came out with the following memorable statement: religion is all very well in its place, so long as you don't take it too seriously. Naturally, we are terrified of fanaticism in religion. Is it going to lead to division in society or even to terrorism? But of course, such religion is a perversion, not the true thing. If all of us took our faith more seriously, we'd be more understanding to people of other faiths, not less. We'd be more merciful to those trapped in sin, not more judgmental. No one is ever going to be converted to a faith that has died the death of 100 ifs and buts. But if we live our faith in such a wholehearted way that people can see something of Jesus in us, then we'll be making our own personal contribution to the renewal of the church, and to the building of that temple of God which the New Testament tells us is made up of living stones, men and women like ourselves who seek God with all our hearts and put everything else in its proper place, outside the temple walls, so to speak, so it doesn't get in the way of the worship of God and the service of our neighbour, which are far more